Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I am a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, and this is Pints with Aquinas. We're going to lead off here with two small announcements. First, I wrote a book. You knew that, but I wanted to remind you. It's called Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly. It is available presently on Kindle. It will be available in paperback on April 18th, but you can pre-order it now as well. And it's about all kinds of cool things, and I'm pumped about it. So I hope that you're pumped about it too. Second thing is I contribute to a podcast called Godsplaining, which is great. You should listen to it. And also, we're having retreats this summer in July and August, which will also be great, and which you should also, in addition to listen to, you should be present for. So check those out at godsplaining.org, where you can also apply. All right, in this episode, we're going to talk about the difference between what it means to make a judgment and to be judgmental. I think a few people, a lot of people, many people, it's hard to say. There are some people out there who are nervous about being judgmental on account of the fact that they observe certain other persons doing certain other behaviors, and they're like, not good. And then they're like, okay, how do I think about this? How do I discuss this? How do I do it in such a way that I grow in virtue rather than grow in vice? Because not interested in the latter, and I am interested in the former. So let's talk about that. The difference between what it means to be judgmental and to make a judgment. Here we go. All right, so let's start with judgment. When we talk about judgment, we're talking about an act of the mind. All right. So whenever you encounter something out there, you typically pass through three acts of the mind. The first act we just call apprehension, and it is what it sounds like. There's a thing out there, and you're like, whoa, look at that thing out there. And that thing out there takes up a kind of life in your mind, or a kind of residence in your mind. So we refer to that as abstraction. Abstraction, taken from a Latin word, which means to draw away from. So I see a thing. I draw away from its particular sense instances, all right, and I gain a concept of it. I gain a notion of it. So I might, like encounter a tree or a converter from an American plug to a European plug or a ring light, and I might form a notion of each of those things, all right? Then the second act of the mind is where we find judgment. And St. Thomas says the judgment is a matter of like putting together or taking apart, or as he says it, composing and dividing. So I've already had the experience of the thing, I've apprehended it, and now I make a judgment as to what that thing is or what that thing is not. So for instance, I might say, whoa, like that tree really exists in the world, not just a phantom, not just an image. Or I might say like that tree is green. All right, so I'm putting together tree and green, and as a result of which, I'm making a judgment. Or I might say like that tree doesn't look edible. All right, so I have divided tree from edible. And mind you, for me, it's probably not edible, but for others, it may be. All right, so that's what we mean by the act of judgment. And then the third act of the mind is reasoning, where I go through the different judgments that I have made, and then I form conclusions as to the nature of things or as to how I'm going to live my life. So I might be like, okay, that tree is green, and this t-shirt is green. I wonder how this t-shirt became green. Well, this is naturally occurring and this is artificial. So maybe the greenness that starts there ended up in there by some process that I cannot comprehend because I haven't studied science since high school. Right? So it could be something like that. That might be an act of reasoning that you perform. Now, we're talking about judgments and judgementalism. We're typically talking about practical matters. All right? So when we're talking about practical matters, we're not so much talking about knowing for knowing's sake. We're talking about knowing for doing's sake. Like, I want to get a better sense of all of these different things so that I can perform whatever tasks are set before me. All right? And in the case at present, we're talking about the task of like living your human life and living it well. So when I make a practical judgment, I'm typically saying, okay, like this is an instance of that law, which I learned previously, and as a result of which I am not going to do this thing, or I am going to do this thing. So you're typically taking some principle of like moral wisdom, for instance, like stealing is bad, all right? And then you have a particular experience, like some sense knowledge of a particular instance in your life, all right? Like, this stole belongs to this church, okay? And then I'm thinking, all right, I've got a house mass that I got to go to after I celebrate mass at this place, but I forgot a stole in my bag, so maybe I just take this stole here from the sacristy, and then I can just bring it back the next time I celebrate a mass, but then I recognize the fact that this stole is not my stole. And if I take something that is not mine, that will be an instance of stealing. And then I go, not going to take it. I'm not going to take it. I'm going to find another stole. I'm going to use my little pocket stole, even though it would be embarrassing to celebrate a house mass with a tiny stole that comes like only 16 inches down my torso. Okay? So that would be an instance of a practical judgment. All right, Father Gregory, you said we were going to talk about judgments and judgmentalism, but so far I haven't heard about me thinking bad things about other human beings. All right, so now let's get into considerations of the type of practical judgments that we make about other human beings. All right, so when we make these judgments about other human beings, we're usually observing their behavior. All right, let's say you're looking at a particular individual who comports himself terribly in relationships, okay? Like, oh, look at him getting overly familiar with this other individual. I bet you he attracts her to him, and they date for a short amount of time. She leaves heartbroken, and then he doesn't respond to any of her text messages, and then just lather, rinse, repeat. Okay, so you see the behavior, all right? And then you make a judgment about the behavior, about where it tends, about whether it's good, and about maybe how you would comport yourself in a similar situation. So the question there is, by making that judgment, have I done any harm to that individual? And here, I think it's helpful, again, just to be very simple, very modest in the way that we describe the situation. What I just said is not sinful. It's not vicious. It's just based on your sense experience of a reality with which you have contact, and you're making a judgment about it. It's like you've apprehended it, and now you're composing and dividing, and you're performing a series of reasoning steps in order to arrive at greater certainty about the things that are done in the world and maybe the things that you are to do in the world. All right? Now, when that type of judgment that we just described here, when that type of judgment, though, becomes, what will one say, either prejudicial, okay, or it gives way to sinful behavior, then we have judgmentalism on our hands. So let's describe those two things at greater length. One, prejudicial would be, I don't have perfect access to this other human being, okay? I don't have perfect access to this other human being. But I've seen a couple of instances, all right? And I have a basic sense of how things are going to go. I don't have certainty, but I have a basic sense of how things are to go. I would say that my behavior would be prejudicial if I went around school and told every other female in school that this guy might potentially try to date you, and if he does, you should shun him like Charlie the Unicorn shunned the non-believer, okay? I would say that that would be prejudicial treatment because this individual has the capacity to change, and maybe it would be more fruitful to address it with him than going around your entire school besmirching his name such that it becomes a bad name. All right? So that would be like an instance of prejudicial treatment. And then when it comes to, this kind of giving way to sinful activity, I think here especially of sins of speech, all right? So if you use it as an occasion to, revile this person, right? Or speak contumaciously to this person, or if you use it as an occasion to, spread lies or like suppositions, to detract, to gossip, to try to undermine that person's reputation, to try to undermine that person's friendships, then I think that would constitute a kind of judgmentalism which is spilled over into further sinful action. All right. Now, we're going to introduce a principle here that helps us to rein in the tendency of judgmentalism, helps us to abide in the truth of our judgments, but not to take it in a direction which ultimately undermines our own character. And here we can draw on St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas says that we should have a kind of, what will we call it, an epistemic humility when it comes to judging other human beings. One, because other human beings are deep water, okay? So when you look at the creation, all right, you have like rocks, and then you have plants, and you have animals, and you have human beings, and angels, and God, all right? And as you go up the great chain of being, there's greater and greater existential depth there, all right? So when I judge a rock, I'm pretty sure that I know what's going on there. I'm like, that's a rock, all right? But when I judge a plant, I'm less sure that I know what's going on there. And so too with an animal, and so too even more with men, angels, God. You see where this is tending, all right? So we need to recognize the fact that we do not yet wholly know what is in the heart of man, all right? So we can't pretend to have a comprehensive knowledge. We do know what has transpired before our gaze. We know what we have beheld with our very eyes, and we can judge that behavior. All right, we can craft a kind of moral wisdom or a moral knowledge on the basis of behaviors that we have observed and the consequences which we see to transpire from them. And then we also can imagine in our own life with a kind of moral creativity how it would work with us because we have access to our own interior lives in a more excellent way. You know, we can have a sense of other people's interior lives, and we can gain a better sense based on conversation, based on prayer, based on reading good literature, for instance, but we don't have it fully and entirely, even in our own case. So we have to introduce that principle of epistemic humility so as simply to say, I don't yet wholly know, all right? So we're not saying like this person has probably excellent intentions for this serial pattern of dating. We don't have to make stuff up, all right? But we do have to be humble. And then the second thing is just introduce a kind of note of charity, all right? Why? Well, St. Thomas says there's a difference between judging things and judging people. Because when you judge things, they don't stand to suffer from your judgments. If you look at a piece of rock and you're like, dude, such a weak rock. I pity that rock. That is a silly rock. The rock's not going to be like, dude, ease up, all right? I'm sensitive because it's a rock, all right? But if you do that of another human being, you could stand to wound that human being in your own estimation, but also, again, if you give vent to that judgment in your conversations or in your interactions with other human beings. So we should introduce a kind of charity into our judgments with the recognition that I might judge wrong, right? Epistemic humility. And this person could suffer as a result. So I should stay my hand. I should stay my judgment in light of that fact. All right? So then what we take from this, or what we gather from this, is on the basis of an epistemic humility, and on the basis of, this kind of charity that we extend to other human beings, we ourselves are responsible for kind of crafting wise behavior, for crafting wise agency, to comport ourselves well in the world such that we become virtuous, right? And that we encourage others in virtue. So when it comes to other human beings, there might be people for whom you're responsible in love or even in justice. And it's for us then to maybe correct them, or it's for us to encourage them. It's for us to love them unto a better version of themselves, to coax the good out of them, as one of my professors once said often. But that doesn't mean that we become victims. That doesn't mean we become naive or Pollyanna-ish about other human beings and their failings. So if we judge a pattern or a series of interactions, to be bad, we don't want to expose ourselves to suffer from them, all right? We don't want to do so imprudently. Now, there may be occasion in which we are, as it were, preyed upon, or there may be an occasion in which we fall victim, right, to the excesses of others. And I think a lot of people think about this when they are asked for money by poor people. A lot of people think like, I bet you're not going to do with this money what you say you are going to do with this money. That may be true, but we don't know, all right? And it's for us to give to the poor insofar as we recognize Christ therein. Now, how you give to the poor, that's a matter of your prudence, whether it be money, or whether you buy food, or whether you offer some service, or spend time in conversation. At the very least, though, you affirm the dignity of the other human being who is present before you. You cannot just dismiss them on account of the fact that you have inferred from their behavior that their interior life is not as it ought to be. So, I think on the basis of that, we have a good way to distinguish between what it means to be judgmental and then what it means to render judgments which are a part of the process whereby we become prudent and whereby we grow in love for others, and ultimately for God. So that's all I want to say. Boom. This is Pints with Aquinas. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe to the channel, push the bell, get email updates and other sweet things that come out from the channel. Also, if you haven't yet, please do check out Godsplaining. Specifically, check out the retreats that are on offer at godsplaining.org. We hope to see you this summer. And then lastly, I mentioned it at the top, but I'll mention it again because I can't help myself. But I wrote a book. It's called Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly. And some of the principles which you heard in this video are described at greater length in that book. So that's all I got for you. My prayers are for you. Please pray for me. And I'll catch you next time on Pints with Aquinas.